Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's talk. My name is Shora Esmailian. I work as a cultural journalist and a writer in Malmö, and I have for more than 2 decades been active in the solidarity movement for Palestine. And I will be your moderator for tonight's talk. For almost 1.5 years, we have been witnessing Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, the first life-send genocide in history. We have witnessed the Israeli aggression in Gaza being carried out with precision and intention of systematically eradicating all aspects of Palestinian life. We have witnessed the most brutal and intense bombing of a densely populated area since World War II. The deliberate starvation of an entire population and the largest number of journalists, health workers, and UN personnel killed in a conflict zone ever. We have witnessed the calculated killing of Palestinian children. We have witnessed the same violence and aggression that the Israeli military carried out in Gaza, now directed towards the population in the West Bank. It has become more and more clear that the state of Israel and the ideology it is based on, Zionism, has no limits, no boundaries. A genocide on the Palestinians is the logical end and the last destination of Zionism. This is why the progressive forces of the world have stood up with the Palestinian cause, with the Palestinian people and their struggle and aspiration for freedom for almost 1.5 years. The solidarity movement for Palestine have in our millions been marching the streets, staging protests at university campuses, raising our voices in courtrooms, organizing cultural events, initiating workers' blockades of arms on their way to Israel. We have been disrupting the business as usual in the Western world that is aiding and being complicit in Israel's ongoing genocide. But we have also been met with repressions in our part of the world. We might feel tired, we might feel hopelessness, but the fact is that we have never seen this amount, an unprecedented wave of grassroots solidarity with the Palestinian people in the Western world. But how do we reach that critical moment when our movements put the much needed pressure on our governments and on our companies and businesses to stop their complicitness in the genocide? The moment where Israel stands alone and can no longer commit atrocities towards the Palestinian people, the moment of accountability for the leaders of the state of Israel. Tonight, I have this prominent panel to discuss these issues and these very important and pressing questions. Anna Johansson is a director of Amnesty Sweden and has extensive experience working with human rights for over 20 years. Greta Thunberg is climate activist that for many years have been struggling for climate justice, but also for the freedom of Palestine. And last but not least, we have Omar Barghouti, one of the founders of the BDS movement, Boycott, Sanctions and Divestments Against Israel, a movement that has been launched 2 decades ago by a broad coalition from the Palestinian society, inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle, rooted in the long past century of Palestinian popular resistance with the aim to stop Israel's occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. So Omar is going to start with a talk, about 15 minutes. After that, we will start the talk with the whole panel, but at 5:30 we will take a short break for the ones who are fasting to break the fast. Iftar is tonight at 5:32, but please be seated if you can, don't go out. And after a short break, we will resume the panel discussion. So Omar.
Hello? Yes. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for everyone who has come here. Thanks to the organizers. I'm honored to be with my esteemed co-panelists tonight. Egyptian and Greek mythologies mention the phoenix rising from the ashes, while Palestinians in Gaza have shown that this is not entirely a myth. With the shaky ceasefire barely holding, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian survivors of the US-Israeli genocide have emerged from the carnage in this land, whose civilization goes back 4,000 years, marching to the north of Gaza with hope, despite knowing that almost all their homes, roads, services, schools, hospitals have been wiped out. The real aspiration of most of them is to keep marching home, to where their families had been ethnically cleansed during the 1948 Nakba. But why should most people worldwide, including in Sweden, care? Working people are engaged in their own justice struggles, given the rise of fascism, systemic racism, cost of living crisis, environmental crisis, exacerbated by underlying structures of gross inequality, neoliberal austerity, and resilient coloniality. Here are 3 points to help to respond to the question, why should we care? First, justice is indivisible, as Angela Davis says. We all have an ethical duty to consistently stand in international solidarity with struggles against oppression everywhere. South African jurist John Dugard said many years ago, quote, Palestine has become the litmus test for human rights, end of quote. He was referring to how the global South measures the West's sincerity on human rights, partly based on how it deals with Palestine. Just as in the 1980s, millions engaged in solidarity, including myself, in solidarity with the struggle to end South African apartheid. So are they today standing in solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle and against Israeli apartheid. Second reason, the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality intersects with struggles for racial, indigenous, economic, social, gender, and climate justice everywhere. Israel's regime of oppression, after all, is a model for much of the world's authoritarian leaders. It harms not only Palestinians, but also millions of others around the world. Israel today is a partner of fascist parties in the West, including in your country, most of whom are anti-Semitic to the core. It's a partner of far-right regimes globally. It sells its military security technologies and colonial doctrines as battle-tested, of course on the bodies of Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, and others. From the export of weaponized spyware technologies and its disinformation and election rigging services as a diplomacy tool, Israel has for decades been a culprit in not just illegal surveillance and influence in the West, but also war crimes perpetrated by dictatorships worldwide. Also, the West's unabashed hypocrisy on Ukraine versus Palestine has aggravated global revulsion of the West's colonially patronizing pontification about human rights. Indeed, the West's fervent support for Israel's genocide in Gaza, the world's first live-stream genocide, as was mentioned, has finally shed the already torn mask of humanitarian liberalism, reducing international law to tatters, as Ireland's president puts it, and ushering in an unbridled era of might makes right, of what the UN Secretary General calls an unprecedented era of total impunity, thus Trump. Everyone should have a keen interest in, not just an ethical duty of, reversing this fatal descent of humanity to the abyss. Otherwise, Gaza will be just a microcosm of what will come to the world. Third, the profound ethical obligation to do no harm and to repair harm done by you or in your name. Palestinians are not begging the world for charity. We're calling for meaningful solidarity. But before both, we're demanding an end to complicity, to do no harm. Ending complicity in grave human rights violations is a matter of duty, not discretion, particularly when one has the capacity to act to end such complicity without incurring undue harm to oneself. As the struggle that abolished apartheid in South Africa has shown, ending state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's system of oppression, especially through the nonviolent tactics of BDS, is the most effective form of solidarity. In the words of Craig Mukhaibar, a former senior UN human rights official, the ICJ ruling, the International Court of Justice ruling, that Israel's occupation is entirely illegal and that it's practicing apartheid, he said, this makes BDS, quote, not only a moral imperative and constitutional and human right, but also an international legal obligation, end of quote. Citizens of quasi-democratic states like yours have an ethical obligation to strive within your spheres of relative influence to end state, corporate, and institutional complicity in Israel's regime of settler colonialism and apartheid, and most urgently, its ongoing genocide. Dozens of UN experts have called on all states to immediately stop all arms exports to Israel, as has Amnesty International, of course. They have also called, those UN experts, for imposing, quote, sanctions on trade, finance, travel, technology, or cooperation. Still, your government continues its shameful complicity in Israel's crimes, including the arms trade, dehumanizing Palestinians and thus enabling and justifying Israel's atrocity crimes against us. This racialization is not unique. It pervades most Western governments, institutions, and corporations, unfortunately. 5 centuries of European and Euro-American colonialism, slavery, and pillage across the world cannot but leave its dehumanizing racist imprint on the cultural DNA of the West. Just as men in all societies must consciously and persistently struggle against built-in sexism and patriarchy, white people must consciously and persistently strive to exorcise built-in racism, coloniality, and dehumanization. This exorcism is most effectively done in the struggle to end complicity. BDS provides the most effective way of doing just that. So what is BDS, briefly? Launched in 2005, the nonviolent BDS movement is led by the largest coalition in Palestinian society inside historic Palestine as well as in exile. It's inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle, as was said, and the US civil rights movement. It's also rooted in a century of Palestinian popular resistance. It aims at ending Israel's occupation and apartheid and upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return home and receive reparations. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement categorically opposes all forms of racism and discrimination: anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, sexism, anti-Black racism, and so on. BDS targets complicity, not identity. A 2022 poll, for example, shows that 16% of all Jewish Americans support BDS, with the percentage rising sharply for those under the age of 40. They understand that there's nothing Jewish about Israel's siege, ethnic cleansing, massacres, land theft, occupation, apartheid, or genocide. And therefore, there's nothing anti-Jewish in supporting BDS to end these crimes and systems of injustice. Over the last 2 decades, the BDS movement has built a massive network worldwide, supported by trade unions, farmers' coalitions, as well as racial, social, gender, and climate justice movements, together representing tens of millions around the world. BDS has played a significant role in the divestment of giant sovereign funds in Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and elsewhere from complicit companies and banks. It has made large multinationals such as Veolia, Orange, G4S, among others, end their complicity, And we're still working on McDonald's and Coke. We'll get there. Norway's pension fund, the world's largest sovereign fund, has divested its entire $500 million worth of Israel government bonds, as have the United States-based United Methodist Church and Presbyterian Church USA. Many universities have cut back their academic or financial ties and complicity with Israel, while tens of thousands of academics and artists have endorsed BDS, which targets complicity, not identity, institutions, not individuals. City councils, especially in Europe and Latin America, including in neighboring Norway, have taken decisive measures against Israeli apartheid and companies supporting it, or adopted what we call ethical procurement policies. Dock workers' unions in Belgium, Catalonia, California, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and elsewhere have taken actions against Israeli ships or arms shipments to Israel. Israel's economy is experiencing what 130 top economists describe as, quote, a spiral of collapse, end of quote, with an almost unprecedented brain drain, a nosediving tech industry, and a credit rating that is near junk levels, according to Moody's. Increasingly seen by investors as what we call in the BDS movement a shutdown nation, Israel has ranked dead last among 50 countries in the recently released Nations Brand Index. Intel has frozen its planned $25 billion investment in Israel, and investments in Israeli high-tech is drying up. Investments are drying up. The chairman of the Israel Export Institute admits, quote, BDS and boycotts have changed Israel's global trade landscape, end of quote. In a recent week of action, targeting the US oil giant Chevron for its crimes against indigenous people from Ecuador to Palestine and its environmental crimes, the climate justice and Palestine justice movement came together like never before, affirming the organic intersection of our struggles. And Greta played a very important role in that week. Thank you, Greta. The struggle to dismantle Israel's decades-old regime of oppression goes hand in hand with global struggles for justice, including climate justice. The catastrophic climate crisis is exacerbated by global inequality and oppression, and is mainly caused by complicit governments and corporations that put profit before people and planet. Indigenous Palestinians living under these conditions, with no control over their land or natural resources, are highly vulnerable to the climate crisis. With Israel monopolizing resources, destroying agricultural land, denying access to water, rising temperatures are exacerbating desertification, as well as water and land scarcity, entrenching climate apartheid, and this was all before the genocide. Imagine the climate catastrophe that this genocide is causing beyond the unspeakable human cost. In Gaza, Israel is not only committing a genocide against 2.3 million Palestinians, it's also committing what international law experts and UN experts call domicide, the mass destruction of homes and living conditions to make a territory uninhabitable, and it's committing ecocide. Though the full extent of the damage caused to the environment by Israel's relentless bombardment and destruction, mass destruction of Gaza, has not yet been documented, satellite imagery provided to The Guardian in March 2024 already showed the destruction of about 38 to 48% of tree cover and farmland. That was in March last year. Analyzing the images, the report in The Guardian said, quote, olive groves and farms have been reduced to packed earth. Soil and groundwater have been contaminated by munitions and toxins. The sea is choked with sewage and waste. The air polluted by smoke and particulate matter. End of quote. The scale and long-term impact on Gaza's ecosystems and biodiversity are enormous. Israel's munitions have left behind hazardous materials that contaminate the soil and groundwater, posing a significant threat to the ecosystem. Well before the genocide, Israeli forces have regularly sprayed Palestinian farmlands with highly toxic chemical pesticides, further exacerbating environmental damage. Despite all these crimes against Palestinians and against the environment, Israel has always striven to present itself as green, a strategy called out by Palestinian solidarity activists and climate justice activists as greenwashing. But what about the unprecedented repression that was talked about in the introduction? This violent and often racist repression aims to achieve two main goals. First, to colonize the minds of the protesters, the human rights activists, especially students and youth, with despair, to dismiss their inspiring solidarity mobilizations as futile. Second, to distract from the demands of the solidarity movement, ending the complicity in Israel's genocide and its underlying regime of settler colonial apartheid. Today, creative and fearless students and other youth are amplifying BDS demands like never before, inspiring us greatly, and at a personal level, filling me with a warm sense of déjà vu. In 1985, I'm old, in 1985, I was a student at Columbia University, again in the dark ages. I played a tiny part in the 3-week peaceful blockade of Hamilton Hall, renamed Hind's Hall, now renamed. We demanded divestment from apartheid South Africa. It was a Black-led movement, the Black students-led protest that quickly morphed into a mass movement, receiving praise from the ANC, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Audre Lorde, among others, eventually led Columbia to fully divest from South Africa. It was the first major US university to do so. Everyone who participated in that fateful protest and thousands like it worldwide will always cherish that we were part of a righteous struggle that triumphed over a seemingly invincible regime of oppression. It always seems impossible. They keep telling us it's impossible until it's possible. We make it possible with our agency, our speaking truth to power, our building of counter-hegemonic power, partly through mass intersectional coalitions, our learning from the lessons of effective previous and current justice struggles, and our ethical, strategic, and passionate commitment to our inalienable rights. When you feel overwhelmed by their McCarthyite oppression, please remember, here, they try to silence you mostly with intimidation, anti-democratic legislation, and character assassination, possibly. In Palestine, Israel tries to silence us with bombs, bullets, and bulldozers. Yet, we steadfast, we resist, and we insist on our full menu of rights, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu once put it. But some still complain of genocide fatigue and not seeing hope. British Pakistani writer Nadeem Aslam says, quote, "Despair has to be earned. I personally have not done all I can do to change things." So he says, "I haven't yet earned the right to despair." End of quote. The Palestinian Phoenix of Gaza is emerging from under the rubble to reassert to the world that we shall never bow to oppressors or oppression. We shall continue to resist oppression, resist hopelessness, and insist on defending our inalienable rights. But in mythology, a phoenix needs sunlight to resurrect itself. And in our case, that sunlight is blocked by dark, heavy clouds of complicity. Principled and strategic solidarity is crucial to dissipate these clouds so we can rise to our inevitable emancipation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Omar, for this inspiring speech. Now we will take a 10 minutes break because iftar is in 5 minutes, and I think it's better to take the break now, and we will see each other in 10 minutes. Please, if you can, stay in your seats. And now we will start the panel discussion. Anna, you're from Amnesty Sweden, and Amnesty released the report, "You Feel Like You Are a Subhuman, Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza." And especially in Stockholm, this report was criticized from politicians in Stockholm municipality, because you also had a subway campaign. So I just wanted you, if you could a bit reflect on the reception that you got, not only here in Stockholm, but also worldwide, where people in power felt that they could criticize Amnesty for talking about human rights.
Sure. Hello, can you hear me? Nice to see you all. So for those of you who haven't maybe read this report or come across this report, I maybe just wanted to say briefly that this report concludes that Israel commits genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, and that it's doing so deliberately. And I'll try to speak a bit louder. Yes, thank you. So for those of you who haven't read this report, the report concludes that Israel commits genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, and that it does so deliberately. And it's a very long report, it's quite legal in its analysis, but what it says is both that Israel conducts a number of acts that are prohibited in the Genocide Convention, also that we can see a clear pattern of how Israel has acted since the 8th of October 2023, and that we concludes that that these acts are carried through in a deliberate manner. So I could say a lot more about the report and what it concludes and what it says, but that is the abbreviated version. That's the short top-line version. I think, I mean, it's true that people reacted quite strongly to this campaign that we did, not just in the tube, in the underground in Stockholm, but we also had big display boards in Malmö and Gothenburg, and our message was quite simple, stop Israel from committing genocide, basically. But I also think, I thought it was interesting that on this day when we launched this report, and this is speaking from, you were talking about the collective solidarity and the power in working together. I think in something like 40 different countries, this was the absolute headline in the media that day. And we had something like 7,000 or 8,000 articles talking about this worldwide. And we had governments, administrations coming out and talking about what they felt about this report. So I think if people in this room or elsewhere ever feel hopeless and ever feel you can't affect change, I think that's a true testament to the fact that you can affect change. The fact that Germany came out and said they didn't think this report was substantial enough. The US administration came out and commented on the report. South Africa came out and commented on the report. So we had an entire conversation across the globe going. So I think that's something to maybe start with. But yes, then we also had politicians in Stockholm saying that they thought we had crossed the line by putting out these adverts in the tube. And I think it was very clear for us as an organization to say the line isn't crossed by talking about what has happened. The line is crossed when people don't have access to their basic human rights, the right to water, healthcare, food, life. That is where you cross the line. When a genocide is committed, that's when you cross the line.
So because you come from Amnesty and this report is so solid, it's almost 300 pages, but it's still only based not on the struggle of the Palestinians, but it's based on human rights. So why is it important to talk about human rights?
I mean, I think it's poignant that the framework of human rights came at a time in history where the world had seen a genocide and experienced a genocide. So all of these human rights that we're now talking about, the Genocide Convention was actually signed by the governments in the world before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. The Genocide Convention was signed in 1948, in October. In December, the world's governments signed the Universal Human Rights Declaration. So I think it's telling in what context, historical context, did the idea of universal human rights for all, where were they born? And so I think that is the framework that we, even though it's very rigid sometimes, it's very legal sometimes, it's very, I mean, anyone who's read any of these conventions know that it's very complicated to understand what does it actually say. I think it's very important to uphold them and say, this is what we promised ourselves. This is what we promised ourselves as the world together, to say this shall never happen again. And it is important that everyone is born free and of equal rights. And we need to uphold that, because if we let that go, what else have we got to work with? So I think that kind of very fundamental sort of framework of saying this is the absolute baseline, and then we go from there. But of course, you talked about this, Omar, as well. It's now shifting. That both the idea that the world's governments somehow need to hold themselves accountable to this framework, and the idea that other governments need to hold them accountable to this framework, that's all shifting. So I think there's a lot at stake at the moment to ensure that we don't let go of this very fundamental idea, which is the indivisibility of human rights, the human rights for all, regardless of what you look like, where you come from, who you are.
And when you work with Palestine or write about Palestine, talk about Palestine, these past year and a half has been a bit schizophrenic, because on one hand, you have all the UN, the ICC, ICJ, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, everybody's saying, this is fucked up, what's happening in Palestine. And on the other hand, you have Western governments, especially the US, being complicit in the genocide. And if I may be the devil's advocate, are there any limits to base your rights on human rights? Because, as you said, the government started to talk about it, even Germany, even the US. But is there a risk that human rights as a concept becomes obsolete?
Well, I think the important thing is also to say that the struggle for our rights, the struggle for our human rights, needs to be relived, powered, kind of re-emerging all the time. They don't just exist there on the paper. We also need to work very hard to uphold them. So of course, if we just consider this a document somewhere in a locked cupboard, then there's a real risk. But I think the way that we are in Amnesty, in other organizations, in this room, constantly are reclaiming our human rights and reframing our human rights and interpreting our human rights, I think that's when they come to life. But of course, there's also shortcomings in these documents and issues that fall between. And I think the struggle for climate justice is a clear case where we haven't had the rights. What can we point at to say this is a human right? It was only a few years ago that was actually considered a human right. So I think, of course, there's shortcomings, but I also think we need to think these are our rights to reclaim, reframe, take control of, as it were.
And Omar, a question to you then. It took, for example, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty kind of a long time to start talking about settler colonialism, apartheid, but then they did at last. And how can a movement like BDS kind of use this sort of reports or the legitimacy that human rights organizations give to the Palestinian cause?
Well, first, I would draw a big distinction between Amnesty's reports and those by Human Rights Watch. Legally and ethically, there's a huge gap between the two. No time to go into it now, but you get my drift. Don't get me started about Human Rights Watch.
Me neither.
We appreciate some of the work they've done, but throughout this genocide, Palestinian civil society has been extremely distraught and depressed and angry at Human Rights Watch's work. So let's keep that on the side. Let's focus on the brighter side, on Amnesty. Amnesty has not discussed settler colonialism, not yet. This is maybe in 2 years, not yet. But when Amnesty issued its report on apartheid, it was a landmark report. Because Amnesty is the largest human rights organization, member-based, and therefore it's not an NGO that depends on donors and follows some political agendas, it follows its members. Was Amnesty always as good as it is today? I'm old enough to know otherwise. When we were struggling against apartheid South Africa, Amnesty was not to be found. It was really weak on apartheid. People think that Amnesty was Che Guevara on apartheid. South Africa, it wasn't. It wasn't. So it has come a long way. Now, I totally agree with what you said, that reframing, taking control of, reinterpreting international law and human rights is absolutely what we do. As human rights defenders, we're not legal experts, we're human rights defenders. So we see the law as a tool that's extremely indispensable, but not as a dogma. We don't take it as a religion and have faith in it or have no faith in it. We take it and we work collectively with many like us around the world to push the envelope, to reinterpret it, to serve struggles for justice. Some people might say, you mentioned human rights. Here in Sweden, let me not mention God-forsaken Germany. Let's stick to Sweden. And people say, isn't human rights like really caduc, like really old-fashioned? I mean, what did Palestinians get out of this, right? And especially Palestinians. And we have a lot to say about international law and human rights. In most European rules regarding, let's say, procurement, regarding so many rules in this EU machine, do not have human rights clauses. Quite often, our struggle, the intermediate step, is to include human rights clauses. So, for example, European procurement, you can exclude a company legally based on grave misconduct. And what are the examples they give of grave misconduct? For example, discrimination against women, child labor. They don't even mention the environment there, I don't think. But human rights is missing. So when we push, well, what about human rights? What about corporations that persistently violate human rights? Well, you know, that's difficult. Europeans, Swedes. So to them, inserting human rights language is a revolutionary step forward, let alone supporting our right to assert our rights, basically, our inalienable rights, and using the human rights framework to assert our rights. So it is very important, despite all the flaws in the human rights world and international law, despite the white European American domination still in this world, it's shifting. The global South is asserting much more influence, including among international law experts, human rights organizations. We're not silent, passive recipients of divine intervention. You know, the law, no one sees it like that. We're active agents. We have agency to reinterpret, exactly as you said, and take control.
And you also have talked about this ethical procurement policies that you were talking about right now. And how it kind of connects different struggles together. Why is it so important, and how is it connecting for example, the Palestinian struggle with the anti-militarism struggle?
Okay, so there's so many justice struggles that have their agendas, their demands, and they do not necessarily agree on everything, and that's normal. Diversity is positive, it's good. But many justice struggles agree that we want institutions to uphold international law and universal principles of human rights. So we took that as the place where we all intersect, the climate justice and racial justice and anti-militarism and human rights and Palestine justice, we all intersect. And let's find an intermediary step, an incremental step that would help us all. That's why we thought of the ethical procurement policies, ethical investment policies, policies on ethical academic ties, policies on ethical programming and sponsorship for cultural organizations. All of these have in common that they're not specific to any area, any geography, or any struggle. They say this institution, this city council, this university shall not contract, engage with, have relations with institutions, corporations, and so on that are knowingly, persistently implicated in the most serious human rights violations, and underline most serious, not just any human rights violations, like atrocity crimes, as defined by the UN, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. If a company is known on the record with good, meticulous research, proven to be involved in war crimes, how could the municipality of Stockholm say, no, I don't want to exclude it, I want to buy, I want to Caterpillar to participate in the tenders. I saw Caterpillar bulldozers in downtown Stockholm, and I thought, how can we push the municipality of Stockholm, which still has a left-green majority, as I understand, use it while it lasts, So how can we push those ethical principles before the fascists take over, right? So it's very important. Now, if that passes, then Greta can go and say, you just passed this. Well, this and this and this companies, we have perfect research to show they're involved in destruction of the environment. I want them excluded by the municipality of Stockholm. And then I can go, or colleagues can go in BDS Sweden and say, oh, and we have this and this and this, and we have excellent research by the American Friends Service Committee, by Who Profits, and so on, or UN database, we have excellent research. So every justice movement can gain from this foundational kind of principle, if you know what I mean.
Around 20, 25 years ago, when I was active in the Palestine Solidarity movement in Stockholm, we would tear our hairs and say, why cannot anybody else come and join the Palestine movement from the other struggles that we had? But Greta, you have for long been struggling for climate justice. And right now we are seeing this intersection between struggles that Omar is talking about more and more in the Western world. So when did the issue of Palestine become important to you, and why?
Before I answer the question, I just want to address how nice it is to see so many familiar faces in the crowd, especially from Stockholm Academics for Palestine. Give yourself an applause. Who have been, for well over a year, tirelessly working to pressure the Stockholm University to end all academic ties with Israel and get their shit together and end their complicity with the Israeli genocide. So thank you so much. And to your question, what has climate justice got to do with Palestine? For me, everything. I see the climate crisis only as a symptom of a much larger systemic error. The climate crisis is a crisis of injustice based on the logic that humans have different values, that we can sacrifice the vast majority of people and the entire planet just for the opportunity of a very fortunate few to continue making profit and benefit from that exploitation. And that is the same when it comes to the climate justice issue, as well as the fight for a liberated Palestine. Because, of course, it is the same systems that are oppressing Palestinians and all people of color the same systems that are exploiting nature for short-term economic gain and to maintain a geopolitical power at all costs. And of course, there are many clear environmental connections here, as you mentioned. For example, the ecocides that Israel are responsible for, that Palestinians are denied of basic resources like water, and not to mention the, of course, devastating impacts that war has on the climate and environment. But of course, it's not about the environment. We cannot have environmentally friendly bombs. Personally, I am a climate justice activist because I care about people, I care about our well-being. Whether it is wars, oppression, apartheid systems, genocides, or fossil fuels that cause that suffering, it is my obligation to stand against it, especially if it's within a system that I systematically benefit from as a white Swede. To stand with Palestine is to have a sense of basic humanity, and as so many people have said, Palestine has really become the litmus test of basic humanity. And for me, to claim to be a climate justice activist and not demand a free Palestine is just unthinkable, because what is it then that we care about? We care about the futures of our white children that they're going to be impacted by in the future. If we fail to acknowledge and fight against the sufferings of all the oppressed and marginalized people today, then we aren't standing for justice. And if that's not racism, then I don't know what is. And even if you are so selfish that you aren't affected and that you don't want to do everything in your power to end the suffering, well, we see entire regions being destroyed, entire people being targeted and genocided, when you see children and people being systematically starved and burned alive, even if you are so selfish that you don't feel like you want to do everything to end that, then how can you expect a system that allows this to happen to stand behind you? How do you expect a system that allows a genocide to happen to take a few steps back and care about ecology? That is just absolutely absurd. And of course, when we say that we stand in solidarity with Palestine, we are not just talking about that we need a ceasefire. We of course need a lasting ceasefire, but we need an end to the apartheid. We need an end to the occupation and liberation for all oppressed people all over the world, because decolonization is not a metaphor. It means an end to settler colonialism, apartheid, and to all kinds of suffering.
So I want to ask you, Omar, why you have been doing this since 85 or even before that, 82. So why do you think this intersectionality is important in the struggle for a free Palestine? And who do you see as our potential allies in the fight for a free Palestine?
Okay, it's important to take a step back and remind ourselves that intersectionality as a theorized concept was given to us by Black feminists in the US. And we owe them a huge thank you, because many of us have enacted intersectionality without having the theoretical framework. And they just put it together in a simple way, accessible way, to make us understand better what we're seeing, what we're experiencing in real life, which is just in a nutshell that race, gender, class, and other issues, oppressions in all those areas intersect. This is very important because every one of us has different identities. We're not just monolithic, we're not just one identity. And those oppressions intersect against us depending on our positionality. If I'm a black single mother in a certain area where there's a lot of racism and classism and so on, I suffer much, much more than a white privileged male in a Western society, for example. So there are different positionalities here. But the main point is that those oppressions intersect and unite quite effectively, especially now. To make it simple, just look at Trumpism. And it's not just Trump. I mean, European leaders are Trumpists to their core. They're just polite. They're European. I mean, you know, they know how to eat with a fork and a knife. They're not savages like Trump. But he's the same. I mean, he's Europe. That's Europe. This is European colonialism taken to a very vulgar level, right? But it's European. They all did exactly what he's been saying. He's just saying they've done it. He wants to colonize. They've done it for 500 years. He wants to enslave people and throw them out. That's what Europeans do for, you know, for pleasure. So I mean, this is an important point, that these oppressions intersect, oppressors intersect. It is about time for the oppressed to intersect and unite. I've written this and I've said this before. If people thought it's, you know, nice, ethically, yeah, it would be a good idea for all of us to stand together. It's a nice slogan. It's an existential need. It's not a slogan. What Gustavo Petro in Colombia said, that Gaza will be an experiment and we'll all be dispensable, is so true. And it applies not just to people in the global south and racialized communities. Just look at Sweden. For example, what's happening with the erosion of liberal democracy in Sweden. Now, I'm again old enough to remember how Sweden used to be the envy of many in the world. You know, social services, women's rights, it's environmental. I mean, Sweden was like Sweden, you know, the utopia. And look where you are today with bulldozers bulldozing student encampments, with releasing dogs on students at KTH, with firing the dock workers union leader, the courageous, amazing dock workers union leader, for calling for justice. Where people are repressed for expressing themselves, where university rectors have no shame to say we're following orders from some minister in government, the Minister of Education. I could not believe that rectors, self-respecting rectors in a supposed liberal democracy, what I call quasi-democracy, have no shame admitting that we take orders from above. This is not liberal democracy. This is authoritarianism in the making. So we had better unite in a very big tent, broad tent kind of coalition where we don't all agree on everything. Each one of us does their own struggle. But this area where we intersect is extremely important to fight back against fascism, racism, white supremacy, and colonialism. Mm.
Your reading of Sweden is very correct. And I also see, and this is a question for all of you, or a thought, I see a red line between the Israeli violence and aggression against the Palestinians. And when it increases nowadays in our so-called liberal democracies, we also see an increased repression here towards people who stand with Palestinians. As you said, the dock workers, Hamnarbetarförbundet in Gothenburg is a very good example, because what they are accused of is threat towards the nation's security. And that is not something a company should ever use towards a union-based person. It is our politicians. If someone wants to say you are a threat, then of course it should be politicians. So as when Israel is moving right, so also our governments. And why is it that our leaders can talk about democratic rights, at the same time scrap the same democratic rights in order to defend Israel? How come defending Israel is much more important than the rights that we've been struggling here for years. And how do we engage in the struggle when we see this fascist time really taking over? Would you want to start, Anna?
That small little question.
Little question, yeah.
No, I think it's true. I mean, maybe I would use different words. But I think it's very clear that in a lot of in a lot of the countries that you are now mentioning, there's a very clear set of, I would call it maybe authoritarian practices. So not a clear authoritarian state, but practices that are kind of pointing in a authoritarian direction. And I think Amnesty Sweden has criticized quite a few of the policies that the current government has put forward as being, not respecting those fundamental human rights. The principle of everyone's equal before the law, for example, or the principle that that freedom of expression actually means freedom of expression. It doesn't just mean freedom of expression if you say the right things. It's a principled freedom of expression. And I think even in the last few years, we've seen some very worrying examples of even government ministers. I don't know if you recall the former Minister for Migration, currently the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, who said a few years ago that, maybe a year and a half ago, that people who expressed certain sentiments, pro-Palestinian sentiments, should be their right to remain in this country should be revoked. It's a very clear example of fundamentally not understanding what freedom of expression is, because freedom of expression is protection from censorship, is protection from repercussions from the state. And here's a minister of the government saying, we will direct those repercussions against you if you express the wrong opinions according to what we believe. So I think there's a clear movement in terms of authoritarian practices. But I also think, as to your question of why, I think there's also a sort of, why do we let them? They are working on our mandate. They are working on our behalf. Why did we let them? And why do we let them get away with certain things? And so I think this is also this is also a reflection on ourselves. What do we need to do to ensure that this doesn't happen? What do we need to do to ensure that we don't stay silent? And how do we make sure that we uphold, again, those red lines that you're talking about, and saying this isn't okay, not in our name, not here, not now. So that would maybe be my answer.
Greta?
I had mentioned this in another lecture this week, but I don't know how many people have read Animal Farm. I really recommend reading it, especially now. It's like a genius, prophetic piece of art. When the pigs win over the government, they change the rules and they change the meanings of certain concepts. Liberal democracy, Democrats are fascists and liberals are quasi-fascists. What does liberal democracy, in Sweden that is, what does liberal democracy put together mean? A question for Swedes that I cannot answer. But basically, complicity in Israel's crimes, including genocide, did not start in October 2023, obviously. The United States, clearly, Germany, obviously, the European Union, and the UK, Canada, Australia, and others, have been complicit in protecting Israel's illegal system of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation for decades. This impunity did not begin what the UN Secretary General calls total impunity, and he's old enough to have seen it all, and he said, I've never seen total impunity except now, because it's the first live stream genocide. History has not seen a live stream genocide, AI-enabled genocide. This is all the first time. And it's in your face, dehumanizing an entire people that they deserve to die, there's no innocent people. This is the first time that it comes out like this. Not in Myanmar, not in former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, in Rwanda. We've never seen this level of audacious impunity in your face. Now, this is because this is a Western created settler colony. It's part of the club that is committing this. That is the difference. as a leading Republican senator has said, and again, I like the Trumpists because of their honesty. Unlike European leaders who are hypocrites and compulsive liars, Trump is honest about his plans. I mean, he says it outright. A Republican senator, can't remember his name now, I think the leading Republican senator, said, we created the ICC for those in the global south, he didn't call it global south, that commit crimes. We did not create it for us and our allies. Wonderful, that's what we've been saying. So, I mean, he just said it out loud. I mean, that's the secret, you idiot. The Europeans have been covering this for decades. How could you say it? But he let the secret out. And he's the master, you know, the empire, the US. It's not little European poodles, it's the US. So I think we're seeing this kind of erosion of international law like never before. What Israel, the experiment that Gustavo Petro talks about in Gaza, and now Trump is following up with this, we're reaching a level where it's no longer just a threat, it's happening. This erosion is happening, and this will threaten everyone. So they're protecting this because it's theirs, it's protecting the interests, the corporations, the Palantir and Microsoft and Google and Amazon, they're all invested in the genocide. They're all enabling, profiting from the genocide. The oil companies, the Chevrons of the world, they're all invested in it. So it's their experiment, and it's their profits, and it's us against those brown people.
Another company that is profiting on the genocide, and just to get back the conversation to intersectionality. Last week, me and Greta, we were part of a blockade against Maersk. It's a Danish company, the biggest cargo company that have delivered tens of thousands of tons of weapons to Israel during the genocide. And when I listened to the Danish comrades, it was so fascinating how well organized this action was, but also how they managed to kind of cooperate and intersect two different struggles with each other, because Maersk is also one of the biggest emitters in Denmark. So Greta, what do you say about, because there are some different levels of tactics here. Amnesty writes a report, talks about human rights. Omar talks about nonviolence BDS that needs a lot of people. And you were at the protest where it actually shut Maersk's office down for a day. So we're in a point where we're desperate also because we're seeing this ongoing genocide in Palestine. So is it important to have different tactics, and why?
Yeah, of course, that is absolutely crucial. Everyone's role, every step in the right direction from every possible angle that we can push is absolutely crucial. And as you said, people are becoming more and more desperate. And well, we have so much overwhelming evidence from, I would say, some of the least radical groups in the world who are confirming that Israel are committing crimes against humanity. They are violating international law, and they're committing genocide. Of course, the question arises, like, where do we turn to? Who do we turn to? What can we do? Who can we rely on to put an end to this? And as we can see that international law has proven to, in practice, mean almost nothing. It's an extremely valuable tool, but the perpetrators of these crimes are being left with, as you said, total impunity. So the answer to that question is that there is no one that we can turn to, no one that we can trust to stop this from happening. So we more and more have to take matters into our own hands. Palestinians have been resisting this suffocating oppression for decades and have been calling for the international community to also, desperately need to step up. So that was one of the major reasons why we decided to shut Maersk down, because simply there's no one else who is going to do that for us. We have tried all possible tactics, but companies like Maersk are still being complicit and fueling this genocide. And when we are talking about Maersk, I also feel like I have to mention the extreme police brutality that us protesters were met with. It was attacks simultaneously with pepper spray, tear gas, dogs, batons, and so on, which is of course something that pro-Palestinian protesters have to endure constantly, many on an everyday basis. And of course, this is nothing compared to what Palestinians have had to endure for the last many, many decades. And of course, we chose to be there, and they did not choose to endure this. So that's something we have to keep in mind. But also the fact that we are being ever increasingly met with this repression is also a sign that they are scared of us. Otherwise, they wouldn't be passing more and more laws restricting people from taking it to the streets, actively trying to silence people from speaking up. It means that it does have an effect. If we would not do this, the situation would be much, much worse. And just to talking about that, to share some personal examples, I think on an everyday basis, I am approached by people who say either that, oh, we chose to not invite you to this event because now you've become political, or like you can go there and talk about this, but you cannot talk about politics. And like, first of all, do they think I'm going to respect that? But also it shows this absurd idea that you think that the climate is not political, but Palestine is political, which just shows this extreme Palestine exception, which I assume all of you in this audience are very well aware of. So yeah, it's yeah, if that was an answer to
And one of the biggest successes in the Maersk blockade, besides that we shut it down, was that for the first time in Danish media, they started to actually report on what Maersk is doing in a good way, an understandable way for the readers. But Omar, I think a lot of us that were in Copenhagen, we also felt that we are desperate, we are hopeless. We have been doing so much, and the Palestinians are going back to rubbles. We don't even have a left in Sweden saying what needs to be said and putting the pressure that is needed on our government. So finally, we take things in our own hands. So are we moving fast enough?
The issue is it's never fast enough, given the pace of the extermination. So, of course, it cannot be fast enough. But there's human capacity. We're human. We have capacities. Even as a Palestinian who grieves tremendously, who gets enraged tremendously at not just the extermination of my people, but at the silence, at the utter complicity of states that are enabling this and arming this and so on. Of course, it's never fast enough. But I think it's very important that you mentioned the diversity of tactics. And indeed, we need a diversity of tactics because it's all about building power. And I've said this before, we need ethical principles on our side. We need international law on our side. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. We need power. Without power, we cannot speak to the powers that be. They don't respect you if you just have ethics and the law and you don't have power. And the way to build power is not monolithic. There are many ways to build people power. Intersectional coalition power is power, media power, strategic litigation power, and so on and so forth. There's so many ways to do this. Direct action, if it's part of a strategy, is power. So the MERS campaign is a good example because it's not just one-dimensional. The direct action was very important and extremely inspiring and successful, but it's part of a bigger campaign. A lot of campaigning has been happening to prevent Maersk ships from docking in ports. And the movement writ large, there are several groups involved, have prevented Maersk ships from docking in Spain. Some have, Malta, Namibia have prevented other ships, not Maersk, but other ships carrying weapons to Israel from docking. That takes a lot of coordination with governments, lobbying governments, advocacy. So the layer of advocacy and mobilization is enormous to get a campaign against this huge company to succeed. So, but it all has to be part of a strategy because we can't do some action or some demonstration just to vent out anger. Venting out anger is important, it's healthy, but it cannot be enough. It has to be part of a strategy. I'm doing this demonstration to, you have to fill in the blanks, 1, 2, 3. Is it helping me get to 1, 2, 3? And how does the 1, 2, 3 fit into my overall strategy to end complicity? Because Palestinians want from the world two things. One, uphold our rights under international law, at the very minimum, ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return for refugees. Two, end complicity. Don't feel sorry for us, don't cry for us. It's nice, but you know, it's much nicer if you get your companies and your city councils and your universities to end their damned complicity. That's what Palestinians want. So, are we moving fast enough or not? I prefer to say, are we doing everything strategically enough or not? Is everything we're doing, are we channeling our rage, our grief, our frustration, sometimes our depression, are we channeling them in the most effective, strategic, ethically consistent way to end complicity and uphold Palestinian rights? This is the question, that we always have to be strategic. It's not a choice, it's a must, because we have to be impactful in ending complicity.
So to sum up, we need intersectionality not only between struggles, but also between different tactics. And I think the Palestine Solidarity Movement have done really well when it comes to this for the year and a half that we've tried to stop the genocide. So we have 35 minutes left. I still have a lot of questions to this eminent panel, but I've been told that I'm not allowed to just talk to them alone all night. So we will open up the floor, and please state a question if you want to talk. Then you can come up to the panelists later on. And we will also have some questions from online audience. Yes, we will take 3 questions at a time. I already have one question since before from an old comrade that has been active for a long time. So that's the first question to you, Omar. Sometimes it feels like we have all these lists and we should boycott so many things, and then in the end you don't boycott anything. So please, can you comment on that? And 2 other questions. Do we have this thing you can throw? Yes, okay. You really thought my questions were so good, so you don't want to say anything? Wait, Talk into it, please. Talk a bit slower. We'll start like this with your question until they figure out.
So I work with public procurement here at Stockholm University, and we have good guideline documents. And in our public tenders, it also says about human rights and promoting democracy. Now that's not being followed. And what most municipalities and government agencies in Sweden are hiding behind is the fact that we are not allowed to do, quote unquote, foreign policy work. That is left up to the government. So this is what people hide behind when they say we can't do anything, we can't meet the demonstrators. This is what they faltered Gothenburg municipality on when they voted to stop doing work with Israel. They got pulled into court for this, on this thing. So in that context, do you think we should still try to put pressure or here or focus on the government? This is to you, Omar, sorry. Yes, they can't, they're not allowed to do policy work, foreign policy.
Please come down.
Hello, and thank you all three of you for great answers and presentations. I would like to know if you have some insights of how to put some more pressure on the media, because that has been a great point of frustration, at least for me, but I guess for more people around here. How do we put more pressure on media to actually report on what's going on and to actually show what Israel is not the IDF is not allowing them to show as well? Thank you.
I think you will start, Omar.
I can comment on the last question. Thank you. It's a very, very important question that I think there are so many of us who share that extreme frustration with the media and how they are enabling this genocide to happen. It is largely Western media that has created the sort of conditions for us for this genocide to happen. And I think there are some very concrete things that I would like to mention. First of all, support independent media that actually does the job, that actually report good, because there are those, especially journalists on the ground in Palestine, who are risking their lives every day to report about the situation. Support them, but also support your local media who are actually reporting. But then also when it comes to the mainstream media or whatever you would say, contact them, like write to them, ask questions, whether it is in email or write privately to journalists, not in a hateful way, but the more people who contact them, the more pressure will build up. I have so many times spoken to journalists that have said that it really does help for them to show their editors that I'm receiving this response from the readers who are unhappy with our reporting. We should change this, and that really gives the support that sometimes is absolutely crucial in order to convince the editors that it needs to change. Also, flood comment sections. The right-wing extremists and the racists, they are coordinated. So we must also be coordinated. There are very often people who are hired specifically to look and monitor through the comment sections and take input from that. And so many times media and journalists are afraid to publish things, to report about things, because they think they're going to be attacked by these right-wing extremists, these trolls online. So if we instead show them that the opposite is actually the case, that actually the overwhelming majority are unhappy with the way that the media is reporting about this genocide, but on the other side, then that does make a lot of difference. Yeah, that was.
So maybe to just build on what you were saying, Greta, you mentioned this the campaign we had in the underground over Christmas, and I'm absolutely convinced. So there were a couple of politicians that came out and said it was outrageous and we crossed the line and how could we do this? I'm absolutely convinced that the fact that a number of people, individuals, private individuals, wrote in, I'm going to use the very English term, insändare, to very clearly state that they thought this was absolutely the right thing to comment on. This, we should be talking about this. There were insändare, I don't know if you know, in little small letters to the editors. That's the English word, sorry. So there were letters to the editors in Aftonbladet, in Dagens Nyheter, in etc. There were, you know, I saw quite a lot of letters to the editors saying, absolutely not. This is, Amnesty should absolutely be commenting on this. This is absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm convinced that that's what stopped it from becoming broader, this attack on us. That the politicians who kind of did this test balloon, if you want, saw that there was a broad public support for the issue that we were talking about. So to build on what you're saying, I think local amnesty groups have actually aced this in publishing letters to the editors on the local level saying, no, we disagree. No, not in our name. No. So I'd build on that as well. And then I maybe just say one more thing about the procurement. I think there's a very interesting, so this is slightly outside of Amnesty's reach, but there's a very interesting European legislation coming in called the HRDD, I think, the Human Rights Due Diligence Directive, which has just been negotiated now. And so the Human Rights Due Diligence Directive is requiring companies of a certain size to actually look at all of their supply chains and ensure that these supply chains are not in violation of human rights. So it's not a directive aimed at public authorities. But I think that is a very important movement to sort of say, this is a requirement that's now being asked of all businesses in Europe of a certain size. Why should we as a public authority have lower standards than what is being asked of our big businesses? I think there's an argument there for sort of saying we should also have a human rights a sort of procurement, look at our supply chains and make sure that they don't violate human rights. Back to you.
I just think it's very important to address the fact that in absolutely most of the cases, the media is not democratic, and it is owned and very connected to huge economic interests. And we cannot, of course, reduce it to, support this alternative media or write in the comment section. Like, of course, we have to focus on this on a more systemic level as well, and to decentralize media and to make them cut these ties and become more independent.
I agree with what's been said about the media. I could add two pressure tactics if all the above does not work. And if a certain newspaper, let's say, has proven to be, because of its ownership, connection to some dirty business, complicit companies, so they won't change easily, because the owners put editors that toe the line. As Greta said, they're not very democratic, some of those newspapers. So if all the above does not work, there are two tactics. First, ratings. Newspapers care about their ratings, which means how many people actually read them. TVs care about their ratings, how many people watch them, because that's how they sell ads. Well, don't watch them or read them. Start a campaign to convince digital subscribers to cancel digital subscription. If a newspaper in a smallish country like Sweden, let's say they have, I don't know, 50,000 subscribers, 70,000 subscribers, by the way, they make a lot of money from digital subscribers. I know, for example, the New York Times, we found out, it's a very important revenue, the most influential paper on earth, and one of the most genocidal, depends a lot on digital subscribers. So there's thinking now in the US, should we call for digital subscribers to cancel subscriptions, deny them that revenue, and you bring down their rating. You bring down their reputation. So advertisers will start saying, it's not as appealing. It's more controversial. It's not the New York Times that we used to know, for example. So you hurt their reputation, basically. That's the first tactic. The second tactic connected to that, ad money, advertisement money. So digital subscription, advertisement money is huge for all media, right? Private media, corporate media. Now, many activists do not think of approaching capitalist companies to convince them not to advertise in A or B, We have to. We have no choice. So think of companies that are more reasonable, less evil, socially responsible, slightly ethical. No one is perfect. There is no purity on earth. I mean, there is no purity on earth. You just have to dirty your hands and accept less than purity. So a company that you know is big in Sweden and advertises regularly in newspaper X, and it has a social responsibility platform, and you know some very progressive journalists writing there, and then we have a leeway. We have a way to get to them and convince them, stop advertising in this newspaper. We're launching a campaign of pressure because this newspaper is regularly dehumanizing Palestinians, publishing propaganda, refusing to publish the truth about 1, 2, 3, 4, rejecting op-eds, opinion editorials, opinion articles by even very prominent academics and writers and so on, just because of bias. So help us in this campaign by stopping your advertising and telling them, I am pulling my advertisements in this paper because of your bias. The way I speak, when I got someone from the New York Times to ask me, would you be interested in an interview? I said no. Not that you're just genocidal. You're way beneath my professional standards. So it's important to get that out as pressure tactics. On procurement, I happen to have met with some people in Gothenburg, some people in members of parliament here, and we've discussed this issue. We've met with social democrats, the left, the Greens, so we've discussed this issue. Clearly now, many colleagues and many politicians in Gothenburg realize what went wrong. Because if you're putting together a resolution for a municipality, for a city council, you need to make sure it does not target a specific state. It does not target states, because this is well beyond a municipality's mandate. Then they can use the foreign policy. You're doing foreign policy, that's not your mandate. So yeah, they pulled that card, and that's to be expected. It's best for municipalities to stick to their mandate. Their mandate says they decide whom to contract and whom not to contract based on objective criteria. Social responsibility, environmental responsibility, human rights. There's absolutely nothing foreign or policy in this. This is the mandate of every city council, every university, every institution can and should decide, especially that this is international law. So being in line with human rights principles is in line with Swedish law, European law, international law. So they cannot, no court will turn that down. If you adopt an ethical procurement policy, there is no court that I can think of today in Europe, maybe in 10 years, you never know, fascism keeps rising, but today in Europe, I don't think any self-respecting judge will turn it down. A city council like Gothenburg or Stockholm saying, I will not contract a company involved in grave human rights violations, war crimes, and so on. And the judge says, no, this is unallowed. Why? So, and I'm seeing a pattern here, foreign policy and Palestine. It's whenever it's Palestine, it's policy, it's politics, as Greta said. When it's Palestine, it's politics, and it's not allowed. Okay, so let's not put Palestine in the resolution for now. Just stick to an ethical policy. So we took the Palestine out, so it's no longer political. It's ethical, right? Okay, so once that passes, then we go with the Palestine-specific companies. It's really an extremely difficult to refute or to counter argument. The first question on lists. Where do we begin? The BDS movement does not endorse those long lists. First, they don't work. It's not practical. People will not go to the supermarket and do a master's research. Like every company, who owns it? What is the cousin of the CEO? Did his mother actually do this? I mean, this cannot work. This makes it ridiculous. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but you get my drift. Mainly, if you push criteria that are so loose, If you define complicity in such a loose way, and all those companies that have committed anything directly or indirectly that's in violation of international law, then you end up with 500 companies, or let's say 100. And I've said this before, only the 10 Che Guevaras in Stockholm will actually stick to this list. The tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in Stockholm will not do anything about that. Great, bravo. So what have you done? So to be effective, it has to be collective. It has to be a collective effort. Boycotts only work when they're mass actions. Individual boycotts are feel-good boycotts. I've done my job, I went home, yes, I feel great. Well, it's not about you. You're not the center of the universe. You're doing this in solidarity with Palestinians, remember? In solidarity with Congo, in solidarity with Myanmar, with whatever the solidarity you're doing. Remember the cause. It's not about you. It's about the cause. So you have to be effective. So we believe in targeted boycotts, which says we put all our energies against a short list of companies, go after them fiercely, forcefully, very consistently, and bring them down to cancel their human rights violating projects. And then when you do that, you teach 1,000 companies a lesson that you're human rights activists, you're not just nice and ethical and you know your international law, you can bite too. You can affect their bottom line. So very quickly to end this, we have 4 basic criteria to select a target in the BDS movement, to be strategic and to be effective. First, level of complicity. Obvious, the most complicit companies should be the best targets. Second, intersectionality. A company that violates Palestinian rights is a less important target than a company that violates Palestinian rights and other rights, environmental rights, black rights, women's rights, children's rights, and so on, because it helps us to connect struggles. Third, brand. A company, a Coca-Cola, McDonald's, HP, huge brand that everyone knows, is a much better target than an XYZ that no one has heard of, because media and the public are interested in the big brands. When we targeted McDonald's, at the beginning of the genocide, everyone on earth heard about the campaign. In Malaysia, they brought down McDonald's. I think the revenue went down 60%. Across the world, the campaigns were just flying. It's McDonald's. And Coca-Cola, they're facing the same. So brand is very important. The fourth criterion is potential for success. Even if all the above apply, can we win? Can we achieve our objectives? Whatever our objectives are, can we achieve the objectives or not? If it's a monopoly, let's say Google. I think half of humanity would love to boycott Google. But how? It's very difficult. And we're trying to find very creative ways to boycott Google. We're studying very hard. Where is their weakness? Where can we get to them to do a boycott? We're itching to do a boycott against Google because it's a horribly evil company that's involved in Israel's genocide on top of everything else it does. And now they're against DEI and they're supporting Trump. I mean, what's not to hate, right? But hate is not enough. We don't launch a boycott against Google because we can't succeed. So we use other pressure tactics against Google. Divestment and denial from contracts. So in contracts, let's say cloud services, a city council wants to buy certain cloud services. There's plenty out there. Many of them evil, but look for the least evil. You can't find anything that's not evil, unfortunately, in tech, but you might find less evil. But you deny Google that contract. But more importantly, divestment. Get those pension funds and trade union funds and sovereign funds and the Norwegian pension fund, the biggest in the world, to divest from Google. Not easy, but maybe we can push them to divest from Google. But if you want to convince the Norwegian oil fund, the biggest in the world, to divest from Google, you'd better make a financial argument, not just ethical. I mean, the Norwegians like to think that it's all based on ethical guidelines. We know better. We've been there for 20 years fighting with the Norwegian oil fund. We know better. Yes, ethics is a cover, but there's a lot of financial consideration as well. But we affect financial issues as well. With Intel, it was a financial war to get Intel out of that $25 billion project. It wasn't ethics and international law alone. So Google, we need to show the Norwegian pension fund that Google's stock can actually go down if targeted well enough, strategically enough, by human rights activists. If the Norwegians, they're really savvy in investment, if they notice, then oil fund, of course, the people of Norway are wonderful, very pro-Palestinian, we love them, but their oil fund is vicious. So if we bring Google slightly down, the oil fund will get the message and will say, oh, ethically, it's not good to invest in Google, and they'll pull out and they'll claim it's ethical. Great, fine, whatever they say, just pull out.
And before I let other questions in, because now you've talked a lot about boycott, divestment, can you say something about sanctions? Can we ever get there from our point of view as activists?
Sure, we're not going to get there, we are there. The S in BDS, and it's very important, I'm glad you asked this question, does not mean sanctions in the US-European sense, which is mostly unethical, illegal sanctions, like the US sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, I mean, half the world is sanctioned by the US, illegal, immoral, sometimes genocidal, like the sanctions on Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis, including almost 500,000 children. And Madeleine Albright said, yes, it's worth it. This is the epitome of genocidal sanctions. So in the BDS movement, we absolutely reject such kinds of illegal sanctions. The only sanctions we call for are legal, lawful sanctions that are targeted, not untargeted, not hurting innocents. Plus, the S in BDS is really shorthand for something far more important than sanctions, fulfilling legal obligations under international law. It's shorthand, we say sanctions, but it's not a sanction, actually. In fact, it's when we ask Sweden to end its military trade with Israel, buying and selling, not just weapons, dual use, military items, everything related to the military, we're not asking Sweden for charity, and we're not asking Sweden to impose a sanction. We're asking Sweden, fulfill your obligations according to international law, especially after the ICJ2 rulings. The risk of genocide is enough to trigger the legal obligation to end the arms trade with Israel, let alone the occupation is entirely illegal. Every weapon, every military materiel, including dual use, sold to Israel or even bought from Israel because it's field tested on Palestinians in Gaza, is illegal. You've got to stop it. So the S in BDS is about fulfilling obligations. We don't care if Sweden froze Netanyahu's bank account. I'm sure he has no bank account in Sweden, and he won't open a bank account in Sweden because you're not Switzerland. But although some might want to think, but you're not. That we don't care about those kinds of sanctions that they imposed on Russians and so on. We care about fulfilling legal obligations. That is where it hurts. You have to fulfill legal obligations, and it's very effective, and it's targeted, and it's lawful.
And for the audience, just to say, we have a campaign like that in Sweden. It's against Aimpoint, a Malmo-based company that is selling parts to, what do you call that in English? To sniper rifles. So we are trying to have that campaigning in them. Okay, so
you have a working microphone now.
But wait, we have one there. I have to decide because it's all dudes talking right now. So we have, I'm sorry to gender you, but in my view, you with the red kofia, yes. Yes, please.
Hi, sorry. Thank you all for talking today. Yeah, my question was more about tactics. I know that there's been some critique and discussion within the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and the student movements at large about BDS's choice to distance itself, at least rhetorically, a bit from armed resistance and that kind of, way of. And also, I think in terms of the reactions we see to even peaceful protests, I think that there's a lot of necessity to discuss the, I guess sort of how effective the tactic is of trying to appease or at least seem respectable, or if that is sort of a tactic that people take in terms of trying to get on board what Malcolm X and MLK would have referred to as the white liberals, who will maybe never get on board and always see Palestinian solidarity and Palestinians as being inherently violent and threatening. Colin Kaepernick kneels as a form of resistance to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and yet is also vilified even for an extremely passive and very peaceful way of showing resistance and fighting for, equal rights. And so I wonder how useful we think that sort of strategy is in terms of trying to negotiate with a class that has proven themselves to stand time and time again with fascism and against the rights of all people and continually stand on the wrong side of history. And yeah, I think it's something like that is what I'm sort of saying.
Thank you. So we take two more questions. We have two online questions from Hassan. He asked, can we take the university board to court for not cutting ties with Israeli universities and companies involved in genocide, given that each university has ethics policies prohibiting such collaborations? And the last questions for this round, and I'm sorry, the last questions may be tonight. We'll see how long they take to answer. My question is more of an international character, more specifically on our own region in the Middle East. Many of our countries' regimes are also complicit in the occupation or the genocide in different ways, whether it's the PA, Palestinian Authority, on the West Bank, Jordan, Egypt, or the normalization process from the Gulf states, etc. So for activists working internationally with the issue, what is your view on how the BDS could spread work in our region? That means in the Middle East. Yes, those are the questions. Anybody want to start?
On the first question, it reflects lack of knowledge, actually. It's false. It's based on a false premise, unfortunately. And it's really unfortunate when I assume you're in the solidarity movement that you repeat such false propaganda against the BDS movement. The BDS movement's position for 20 years, we've been around long enough, has been absolutely consistent. Actually, I have it here, so let me read it. The same text, it has never changed. Quote, in harmony with international law, the nonviolent BDS movement defends the right of the indigenous Palestinian people to resist Israel's decades-old regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and military occupation by all available means, including armed resistance, as mandated by numerous UN resolutions, including UNGA Resolution 37/43 and UNGA Resolution 45/130, with strict adherence to the principle of prohibition against targeting non-combatants. And this is pretty much a Palestinian consensus type of clause. And the second part, it says, quote, the use of force against non-combatants is prohibited, whether from the oppressor or the oppressed. Thus, despite the massive power imbalance and crucially, the just as massive moral asymmetry between the colonizer and the colonized. So this is the position of the BDS movement forever. And it's basically inspired by the teachings of the Brazilian philosopher, educator Paulo Freire, who's a big inspiration to us in the movement. Paulo Freire famously said, among many things, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of his key books, in any situation of oppression, violence begins with oppression. With the beginning of oppression, violence has already begun. Everything that comes after is a reaction to the initial violence, which is oppression. And that's why in the BDS movement, we say, whether you like Palestinian armed resistance or not, to end all violence and oppression. It is the root cause of all violence. Definitely, Palestinians prefer to live in peace. But peace to be worth its name has to be based on justice, has to be based on our rights. And as I said yesterday in Uppsala, thank goodness for Trump's very amicable reception of Zelensky. Now European leaders have discovered something that humanity has never found out about: justice. Now European leaders are telling Trump, you're trying to impose peace on Ukraine that's not worth its name because it's devoid of justice. You want Ukraine without sovereignty, without territorial integrity, without the basic rights of Ukrainians under international law. That is not peace. That's peace without justice, and we cannot accept that. Even the Germans had to mention the J word. The Germans, imagine mentioning justice connected to peace. So we have been in the global south always saying, we don't want peace without justice, means nothing without justice. So that's the Palestinian position. Basically, that's the BDS position, and it's in line with the consensus. Now, the Palestinian BDS National Committee, which leads the global BDS movement, has every single major entity in Palestinian society in Palestine and in exile. The coalition of Palestinian political parties is a key member in the BNC. So that's why it pains me when people repeat propaganda propagated by some very suspicious organizations that I shall not name against the biggest solidarity movement in the world with Palestine, the BDS movement.
Can you just, because we don't have many more minutes,
Yes.
and I have a last question to all of you, but can you just say something about the Middle East and the complicity?
And very, very quickly about taking university boards to court. Strategic litigation means it has to be strategic. You can't just do it everywhere. So to take a board of a university to court, you have to have good legal opinion saying 1, 2, 3, 4, yes, we can win against them in court. You have to prove that they're knowingly engaged in relations that have enabled the commission of serious crimes. So they insisted on having an arms research project with, let's say, Tel Aviv University, knowing that it will be used by the Israeli military to commit war crimes. Then you may have a chance to take them to court, but this is not for activists to decide. If you have an idea, discuss it with legal experts in the movement who know and can give us good advice about this. On the Arab region, we have to end on a negative note. Okay. There's one more question.
No,
Good.
my last one.
Yeah, I would hate to end with this. Okay. Dictatorships, despotic rulers, authoritarian regimes are not friends of peoples, obviously. So Palestinians and our relationship to Arab regimes, it's the same. Arab regimes that are unelected dictatorships are definitely on the enemy side, not on our side. The Arab peoples, the peoples of the Arab region, who are not just Arab ethnically, it's a very diverse region with Kurds and with Armenians and with Amazighs and many, many, many others. So when we say Arab region, we don't refer to an ethnicity. We take it in a more citizen-based form. In this Arab region, the peoples have tremendously stood with Palestine despite the repression. And unlike in Sweden now, in countries like Saudi Arabia, if you dare to demonstrate in solidarity with Palestine, you're in jail for God knows how long. In United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, the repression is just unbelievable. In Morocco, they arrested a BDS activist who was in a demonstration against a ship carrying weapons to Israel using Moroccan ports in Tangier. So the level of repression is unbelievable. So when some in the West ask us, why aren't the Arab peoples up in arms, supporting Palestine? They're trying. But the repression is just, in Egypt, you can end up in jail for a very long time for doing the smallest things. So yes, Arab regimes are definitely not our allies. The Palestinian Authority is unelected, undemocratic, and therefore not representative. We do not think the Palestinian Authority should be called the representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO is our sole legitimate representative, despite its many, many problems. But that's an internal Palestinian problem, how to fix the PLO, make it inclusive, democratic. That's absolutely necessary to make it inclusive, democratic, and representative. But the Palestinian Authority never claimed to represent the Palestinian people. And currently, it's absolutely authoritarian, absolutely violating Palestinian civil rights in the midst of occupation and apartheid. So that is the reality, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm going to take some more minutes of your time because this is really not where we should stop. But so I think, Omar, you said something, a really good quote to some of us that maybe have been losing hope the past months. Despair has to be earned. So I want quick answers from all of you. So maybe we didn't earn the despair yet, but where do you think we as individuals, but also as a movement, find the strength to keep going on in these fascist and genocidal times?
To be honest, I'm very tired of speaking about hope because that's what people expect us to do.
No, strength.
Yeah, but like that's kind of the same thing because in so many cases people are like, okay, can people sitting on their couches being like, okay, can you give me some hope now because I feel despair? And it's like that's the absolute opposite of what we should be doing. Despair is something you have to earn. Hope and hope is also something that you have to earn. Like we are doing this. I think most of us are doing this because not doing anything is not an option. For me, the fact that I don't have to wake up every morning and fight for my right to exist is a sign that I'm extremely privileged. And with that privilege comes a responsibility that I have to do something. So there's simply no other alternative. It takes so much more energy and strength for me to pretend like everything is normal and to not do anything than not. So that's where I get my strength from.
I have a quote from a French philosopher. I keep forgetting his name, but he's not current. He's from the mid 17th century, and he said, "Tyranny organizes better than freedom." And for me, that's a real kind of. I often think about that. Tyranny organizes better than freedom. So we have to reach higher, be better, set a higher standard for ourselves. It's so easy to just let that happen. So that's one of the things that I kind of that sort of in a backward way is it becomes a strength to sort of say if we do nothing, tyranny organizes better than freedom. We have to be better than that. The other thing that I sometimes think about, because I think in Swedish civil society at the moment, there's a sort of ongoing discussion about how our funding is being taken away, and it's becoming very hard for civil society organizations to organize, to mobilize, etc. Doesn't necessarily affect Amnesty at the moment because we don't accept public funding, but it affects many of our friends and colleagues in other organizations. And I just want to remind ourselves that actually in Sweden, the absolute majority of funding to the Swedish civil society does not come from public funds. It comes from individuals like yourselves. So up to 60% of the civil society is actually funded by us, not by anyone else. So I think that is also a sort of something that we have to remember when this is a conversation that I often meet. Now we can't do anything because our funding is being cut. It's shitty, but also to remember that our strength doesn't come from statsbidraget. It comes from somewhere else. So that's maybe also the kind of something to kind of remember. But also, I'll go again with tyranny organizes better than freedom. It's kind of one of those things that I maybe as an inspirational quote to have above your bed before you turn out your light.
Well, I find a lot of sources of strength and hope, despite the unprecedented feelings of grief and anger that I mentioned earlier. And I think most Palestinians are in the same boat. It is so easy to slip into depression, seeing your people being slaughtered while others are arming them ongoing and saying it's okay because they're not really human. It's the most difficult feeling. And sometimes you feel, what can I do? Even everything I'm doing is not stopping it. What gives me strength, two main sources, because I can go on. Two main sources, because we in the BDS movement and I included work with the world, from Indonesia to Chile, from the US and Oslo to Johannesburg and everything in between, we see so many rays of light across the world shining through the darkness. They're not a big, thick beam of light yet that can flood the darkness. We're not there yet, but there's so many of them, thousands and thousands of beams of light. Student group in Chile doing this at the university, students, I don't know where, doing this, a women's group in India doing that. It's just amazing. I can go on how many very effective, strategic, brilliant campaigns are happening all over the world and achieving results. Not just A for effort and C for results. No, A for results. They're actually achieving results. This gives us enormous strength that we are changing things. We're not just doing everything we can, we're actually changing things. 2 years ago, we had 0 countries supporting a military embargo on Israel. Today, we have 53. A few years ago, there's so many countries that have begun to impose trade sanctions on Israel or military and so on. This is happening. And it's thanks to millions and millions of activists who have never given up hope and who have seen strength in numbers, in persistence, and in never accepting the wall of complicity as an impossible thing to penetrate. We've been told over and over and over it's impossible. And as I said in my talk, we make it possible. I've seen it in my lifetime, and no one can take away that from me. I was part of a movement that actually was told everything is impossible, and we made it possible once. I know we can do it again. The last point I want to say is that the biggest strength I personally take inspiration from is from our own people. I mentioned it in opening. It was just amazing how immediately after the so-called ceasefire was announced, with that human wave in Gaza, going to the north to nothing, to rubble. Yet they're saying we're going home. We'll erect a tent and stay there, but we want to go home. That legendary Palestinian resilience is the biggest source of hope and strength.
For those of you who doesn't know that, in Arabic it's called sumud, and go home, read on it. It means more than the English resilience. It's what the Palestinians teach us. They actually teach us life. So thank you so much, Omar, Anna, Greta. Thank you to the public.